Welcome into another edition of Spits and Suds. I'm Gavin Spittle of 1053 The Fan. Thank you so much for supporting Spits and Suds this offseason. It's because of you that we keep cranking out these episodes, and we got a good one for you this time. Did the Stars Moneyball their offseason? Their moves have been widely panned, but the analytics like next season's Stars roster better than last year's. Here's why, and here's the twist. That's today's article in D Magazine, written by our guest tonight, who's a regular on Spits and Suds, and for good reason, the great David Castillo. How are you?
What kind of intro is that?
It's a terrific intro is what it is.
I appreciate every positive thing you say. Like I wasn't ready to just kind of jump right. I thought we were going to talk about Gladiator 2.
Oh, my apologies. My apologies. But I will say this article, I read through it, and kudos to you because, and as I tweeted today, because one of the things I love is tweeting you, Sean, Leah, Robert, people that contribute to Spits and Suds on a regular basis. This article made me think, and for that, I give you credit. I disagree with the articles in parts, but I actually think you disagree with the article in parts too.
What are you talking about? I love Matt Dumba. I think Labushkin is better than Tanev. Are you crazy, Gavin? I don't know what you're talking about.
Well, this is an interesting discussion because we're dealing with analytics as opposed to the eye test. And I looked at this offseason, David, as three categories when free agency hit. Those that were upset by the transactions, those that said, I trust in Jim Nill, and those that said, you know what, we actually picked up some decent parts.
I mean, that's it's funny that you say that because it did start out as kind of a little bit of a thought exercise. And part of my process was looking at the data. And yes, I watched the games. We all watch the games. But
Yep.
to me, like watching the games is never enough, especially if you want to kind of talk, especially if you're kind of trying to look back as a retrospective, try to figure out, how they won, lost, how could they be better, how could they get worse, right? And so good example. How many people remember exactly how many shot attempts Wyatt Johnson generated in Game 7 of the Vegas series?
Right.
Right. I mean, I think of to me, it's useful to think of data as like the historical record, so to speak. And so, when I was kind of like going through the data, I think the main thing to me, the biggest thing was, okay. And I realized I don't know if, we want to like talk about like analytics specifically. We don't necessarily have to, because I know you have a show that needs an audience and we don't want to lose that audience. But to me, I was just kind of curious, well, we have numbers for certain things, like a player's, just broadly speaking, their shift-to-shift impact. And one of the things that was abundantly clear throughout the entire season was Joe Pavelski. And again, I hate to keep going off about this, but Joe Pavelski was really bad, right? And so, I saw in this case, I was looking at Micah Blake McCurdy's, his synthetic goal stat, and Pavelski was minus 8.1 in terms of shift-to-shift net rating. And I was like, wow, so losing him is probably going to be a big deal. Now, of course, Dallas brought in some what you might call replacement level players. And, we can kind of talk about them specifically because I think they're a little bit more interested in just like depth, even if that's kind of broadly speaking what they are. But to me, like just looking at that, I was just kind of, it reminded me that the reason why Dallas is competitive and the reason why they're successful is because of the core. And I think people kind of maybe like sort of, and myself included, kind of got lost in reacting to the signings themselves. Like, oh, why this guy? Why this guy? Why this guy? Why not that guy instead? And it's worth remembering, like, I think if you were, and this is really a question for you, right? If Hintz, for example, is playing in the playoffs like the year before, is that not a bigger deal than, say, like Tanev defending McDavid and McKinnon well? Like, if you were to like choose between the two, which one would you rather have? Which one do you think would have made the difference?
I think a healthy Rope Hintz would have made a difference for
Well,
sure.
I mean, yeah, well, a healthy Ruby Hintz and one that's playing like when he was just absolutely bonkers last
Yes.
season. And not that, we should expect that every postseason, but that is whatever determines Dallas's success is going to be within that core. Hintz,
Yes.
Robertson, Johnston, Stankoven, uh, probably forgetting somebody, but Heiskanen. And so I don't want to like downplay the loss of Chris Tanev at all. Just that I think people maybe just kind of forgot, as the Roy Jones Jr. song goes, just must have forgot. Right, this is like an elite core that's still going to drive them towards success. And of course, if we want to get into like sort of the analytics discussion, we could talk about that. I still want to talk about Gladiator 2, but nonetheless, I'll send it back to you.
Well, let's start with, you mentioned synthetic goals, and Micah Blake McCurdy is a very interesting follow regarding his analytics. So synthetic goals, for those listening, basically isolates a player's impact, as you point out in the article, by giving weight to even strength offense, even strength defense, competition, score effects, teammates, and even home ice advantage, as teams experience a major uptick in offense in the second period when playing at home. So basically, that explains what synthetic goals is. So that is what, a good chunk of your article is based on. And with that, Joe Pavelski's in the red, minus 8.1. As I'm seeing it, highest on the team. So, yes, let's talk about Gladiator 2. No, I
so
do.
so
I
in
think
Gladiator 2,
Jason Robertson, by the way, is, tops with plus 15.1, Miro Heiskanen plus 12.3.
we will get back to Gladiator 2, but one of the things that I do want to say at the outset, because I do think it's worth, one of the reasons why like I kind of spent some time kind of talking about analytics is that like I think it's just like any other piece of information, right? You leverage it to better understand, say, like history and maybe develop better language. In this case, the language of value. And I think it helps us tell something, or it helps us, certainly for me, something more important than maybe like a good story, but the right story. Like we shouldn't have to read about how Joe Pavelski was a great player, but then he got old in the playoffs, didn't he? No, we should be reading about how Pavelski was a stupendous player whose impact had been deteriorating for a full year until it reached its nadir in the playoffs. And I think within that, there's a lot, right? When is a 67-point player not a 67-point player? When is a 30-point player actually something more? And that's the other thing I think about sort of when I look at stuff like whether it's synthetic goals or goals above replacement, all that nerd or not language, right? Which is that it also allows us to come up with new stories. Like it would have been easy to write about Wyatt Johnston before the season started and worry about whether or not he'd hit his cliched sophomore slump, or talk about the excitement of his development, stitch some quotes together and call it a day. And not to downplay any of those stories. I think those are important. But thanks to diligent work of hockey nerds like Josh and Luke Youngren, who run Evolve in Hockey, I could talk about how Johnston would probably have a sophomore season in the realm of John Tavares, given the data. And hopefully that's not me trying to gas myself up. That's just like, to me, it's just a way more interesting story. But again, it's also like a news story. And that, I think, that's the reason why I think it's valuable to kind of look at that, not as simply a thought exercise, which is what it started out as for sure, but as a way of, there's nothing to be scared of, right? Analytics aren't there to tell you whether or not you're right or wrong. They're there to be useful and maybe help us tell more stories.
Yeah. You also talk about Lyubushkin in the additions, and how one would think that losing Pavelski and Tanev would severely hurt the analytics. But with the additions, you actually point out that the analytics says these additions is actually greater than a Pavelski Tanev.
Yeah, and that's the part that I think is going to lose a lot of people, right? I mean, that's the part where it's like, that doesn't make 2 + 2 = 4, right? But again, like the data is not really, it's not interested in sort of who we know Pavelski was prior, how great we know Tanev is. It's interested in kind of, well, what is the work they put in from shift to shift? How do they affect shot attempts, broadly speaking, and goal impact? And so I think what the data is seeing is basically that, like, well, um, maybe sort of their intrinsic value is perhaps not what we thought. And I think we saw that in the playoffs, right? I mean, Pavelski, 67 points in the regular season, that should translate, right? That should be, even if even if he's not a point per game player in the playoffs, he should still be good, right? But no, and that's because part of that, because I think in some ways Pavelski's story was also about regression. A lot of his possession metrics have been bad all season. And so to me, the playoffs were just like an extension, just like the sort of regression gods coming home to roost, or regression chickens, I should say. I don't know why I got that phrase mixed up. But so yes, Dallas did not necessarily bring in superior players, but again, what is going to make a difference, what's going to drive them ultimately is that core. And so, like I said, I don't want to make it sound like, I think Dumba and Lyubushkin, in the aggregate, and Brendan Smith are better than Tanev. I don't at all. But I just think that when you consider, you play sort of roster Tetris with simply the value, with just the data, you end up with a, broadly speaking, better team. Again, a lot of that kind of, depends on your mileage about how bad you think Pavelski really was. I personally, I think the data is correct in that assessment. And of course, yes, I watched the games too. I saw how bad his passing was, for example, in the playoffs. And that was largely true in the regular season. There's actually passing data that Micah Blake McCurdy has. It's called setting, that just showed he wasn't a threat. His passes weren't leading to shots. And we could go on and on and on. But at some point, right, we want to talk about, I don't know what maybe we want to talk about Dumba's hit on Pavelski.
Well, I will tell you, here's my eye test.
Okay.
Not against Matt Dumba joining the team. Love his physicality. Would love to see him have a better season than last year, and I'll just leave it at that. Don't think he was great in Arizona, and don't think he was great in Tampa for that short playoff run. That said, I like the player. I was hoping that he would be the replacement for Ryan Suter, let's say. And maybe you go Dumber and Bixel, or if you had kept Suter, go Suter and Bixel. The curiosity I have is with Ilya Lyubushkin, because, and I think this counts as an analytic, David. It's the simplest analytic you can have. What makes this 30-year-old all of a sudden turn it on after 2 stints with Arizona, 2 stints with the Toronto Maple Leafs, the Buffalo Sabres, Anaheim Ducks, and now he comes to the Stars and he gets a 3-year contract? I think that's where my curiosity is raised. And the only comparison I can make is I watched some Lyubushkin highlights, big hits, some nice physicality, good size on the blue line. But what's causing these teams to say, all right, so long, and the stay is not for a long period of time? In the last 4 seasons, he's been on 4 different teams. So what's the cause of a 3-year contract based on that? So that's one of the questions I wanted to raise tonight.
That it's I always want to be clear that I'm not making the argument that Lyubushkin, for example, is a great player, even a good player. And I agree that contract is just, what the heck? We did not need, or Dallas did not need to pay him that much. Now, I'm sure market forces, blah, blah, blah. If you're back into a corner for that much money to Lyubushkin, then just don't do it. Just because people are signing all the good players doesn't mean you have to go out and sign the bad ones. But I do think that, Lyubushkin is interesting because he reminds me a lot of Roman Polak. And Polak was a player that, for a lot of us, especially myself, just did not like. In part because he was sort of your classic. He's sort of the player that coaches always trust, but that kind of deep down, probably shouldn't be trusted. It's kind of like the sort of they're like the hockey's version of like teachers' pets. Like, why do you trust this person? But what I will say in defense of Lyubushkin, and was also true of Polak, and I remember like I went back and looked at tracking data from Corey Schneider on Roman Polak, right? The year that he played next to Miro Heiskanen, and he actually had some like decent quote unquote analytics when it came to defensive zone retrievals and exits. And I think that's something that coaches latch on to. Like, you can be bad at everything else, but if you just make the simple play in the defensive zone and nothing else and don't screw up, then that's better than if you could make the fancy play offensively, maybe score goals, maybe make like huge highlight reel plays, and broadly speaking, be more valuable than that player that can just simply like do some stuff in the defensive zone. And so, I'm kind of starting to wonder just like how much value there is to that. And if maybe, sort of coaches have just kind of known more about hockey than I have all along. And I think that's basically I would argue that's essentially the value with someone like Lyubushkin, which is like Roman Polak. When he's in the defensive zone, he's not going to make a whole lot of mistakes. He's not going to make great plays, but he's a dude that he can do what Lundqvist does not. And that was like the thing with Lundqvist, which was that just could not really make the simple play getting out of the defensive zone. Of course, there's a whole nother story, right? Like, why did they bring him back? But for now, Lyubushkin is not going to have that problem. And that solves hey, let's just play our third defenseman 2 minutes a night and absolutely just, you remember the bear crawls in like football practice? Like to me, that was the equivalent with like doing that to your other defenders. Like, you're just going to play like every shift because we can't trust this dude on the third pair, which was silly, but whatever.
Yeah. I also wanted to second what you said in this column, which is really interesting. I'll call it an article because you don't really express your opinion in that you even say during the article, I I disagree with some of these. So I like it because it's thought provoking, David. And one of the other things that you do bring up that I think Stars fans need to realize is there were two parts. Obviously, you want to improve your team, but you need to keep the future intact. And whether or not the future is going to provide a Stanley Cup, I think that's in question. Of course it is, because these players are so young, so they still have time to develop. But you do point out for every Sean Walker that you and I wanted, for every Matt Roy that you and I wanted, those contracts based on the salary cap going up, it was a spending spree. And therefore, the Stars could not compete in the length due to re signing Wyatt Johnston, Jake Ottinger, as you mentioned, other players. So I think tactically, Jim Nill looked at the future when looking at the free agent market. So, in other words, try your best to win now, but keep the core intact for the future.
Yeah, and it's something that we don't really kind of, I mean, nobody's in here when it comes to negotiations between players, right? GMs talking to agents, players, etc., and trying to kind of woo them. Really, a lot of this depends on whether or not a roster can even fit it into their future cap structure. And if they can't, well, then what is the point of a GM reaching out to them? Now, yes, you can do things differently, like Vegas, and just Wild West it. But like, to me, I don't have a problem with that general philosophy. It's not to say that like I think Neil made nothing but like Neil's perfect. He made nothing but great moves. Just that like there's a clear logic to it that I think maybe fans didn't give credit to, which is, hey, eyes on the prize. Like, as long like let's just not screw up future deals for Johnston, Stankoven, Harley, Robertson, Ottinger, etc. And because again, that's going to drive the team's success to begin with, and hopefully bring in some warm bodies. Neil loves his veteran stopgaps. Not the biggest fan, but it is also worth mentioning, worth reiterating. These are right shots he brought in. And I don't think that's nothing. Yes, we can argue that like, well, you could have brought in a better right shot. I don't know. There's like a ton of better right shots on the market besides the obvious, sort of, blue whales in like Matt Waugh and Brett Pesce. But I mean, again, they're guys that I think can play well within their role. And I do like Matt Dumba. I do think. I mean, the other thing about Dumba, and I realize we're kind of switching between players, is
That's
that
fine.
um, with Dumba, yes, like of course he's had like bad seasons, the eye test, analytics, yada yada yada. But another way of looking at Dumba is kind of a little bit as like a reclamation project, and that's kind of what. Again, this is really optimistic. This is really hopeful, but in his prime, like you're talking about, like a solid top four defender who is
Yes.
still just 29. I think maybe he's already turned 30 or he turns 30 soon. But the point is, like there is a slim possibility that this guy maybe kind of puts it together in a more structured setting, and we're talking about a guy who's who doesn't have quote unquote bad analytics, because that's kind of the value, right? They're always changing, they're always evolving, and so it's hard for me to see like Dumba just being a complete I mean, unless injuries have truly just, I mean, destroyed the rest of his career, it's hard for me to like see Dumba like in a top four role next to someone like Thomas Harley, which I think is the most likely thing, and not have like some value beyond just like knocking guys out in the corners.
Yeah. Yeah. I think the pickup of Colin Blackwell, not talked about a lot, but to be the Chicago nominee for the Masterton Trophy, um, those are once again things that maybe analytics won't necessarily say.
Wait a minute, hold on. Analytics love Colin Blackwell. He's
Well,
been
that's
in
good.
analytics. He's like an Evan Rodriguez. Been I just wanted to point that out.
Well, Jesus, if he's an Evan Rodriguez, let's party. But I love his story. And I think pieces like that in the room, especially when you lose a Pavelski, are important. A guy that, not saying Colin Blackwell is going to be a glue guy, but you know, people rave about him. And you're getting a Harvard educated guy that went through a lot at Harvard and got his degree from there, fought his way up to the NHL. There's just a lot of currency, in my opinion, in that I love a guy that is fighting and clawing to stay on NHL rosters. And I just know a Colin Blackwell is going to give me everything that he's got when he's on the ice.
Yeah, and I think sort of, Blackwell kind of reminds me of sort of basically like an older Sam Steele. And I think that's the player that Stars fans can expect. He's always been a really like underrated playmaker for what has basically just been a depth player his career. And I think it was absolutely like, it was again like we're talking about like Colin Blackwell in the context of like, well, what can we add? But I was just kind of just go back to like I'm a big fan of Maverick Bork and what he can offer. And if you've essentially replaced Pavelski with Maverick Bork, given who Pavelski was at that point in his career, I would consider that an upgrade, a massive one. And not just because I'm like bullish on Bork and think he has everything. Obviously, a very different player than Stankoven, but like certainly like similar in terms of impact, or similar-ish, I should say. And so players like Blackwell are going to be players that just continue to sort of add value lower in the lineup. And I wouldn't quite put him in the realm of Rodriguez, but sort of in that vicinity, especially like in a bottom six role.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I thought that was a great signing. And
I actually thought of like a guy like Patrick Eves that
yeah, and
came into the Stars and had a really good campaign and got traded to Anaheim.
he had a great year. Right. Hold on a second. By the way, Eves was the pick that became a first rounder
Yes.
off of Patrick Eves. Was it Thomas Harley? No, not Thomas Harley. It was somebody good, right? And we would probably
I'll look up.
we'd have to
I know the Yarmir Yarger trade to Boston
got
was
back Jason Dick. I was going to say Sam Dickinson. I'm
Jason
like, if
Dickinson.
only we got back Sam Dickinson. But
Yeah,
Jason
Dickinson came back in that. Yes.
Oh man, yeah. I for some reason, I felt like I always knew that, but yeah,
I love going back and look at these, like the Eric Cole trade turned into Matthias Janmark.
Well, I mean, Janmark and his which one and Hints, right? So the pick that
Right.
because again, Dallas traded a pick that also allowed them to trade up or go up. Was the one that became so like Hints is the one I remember. But yeah, Janmark when he was here was fantastic, and I will die on the hill that Matthias Backman was an NHL quality defender. I just want to throw that out there because I thought he was solid in Texas. I always really liked his game. I felt like he was a little bit kind of quote unquote ahead of his time as kind of a player that uh, sort of reminded me a lot of Anton Strawman. You know, he sort of didn't really like do a whole lot well, but always seemed to be kind of facilitating the puck up ice and kind of controlling possession. But that's neither here nor there. We're not here to talk about Mattias Backman.
No, that's true. I mean, listen, we all have our players that, I will say one player that we talk about term and we talk about we need to protect the future. Alex Martinez was fascinating to me because shot blocker, 3 cups, good room guy, also a local connection, used to live in DFW. I don't know if he still does. I remember when he won the cup, his first cup, he brought it to DFW. So that's a 1 year and I think an overpayment, but you had to get him to Chicago by the Blackhawks, a 1 year, $4 million deal. So that necessarily wouldn't have hurt the future.
Well, the only thing about Martinez, because I agree about Martinez, but of course he plays on the left hand side, right? And Dallas is already like jammed up on the left side with what should be Heiskanen, but is not, right? Lindell, Harley, and of course now you throw in Brendan Smith and Liam Bichsel, and it just kind of makes sense that that Dallas, he's definitely a player that I would have liked, but there, that like the defensive market wasn't exactly that great to begin with this season. You had just like it was very top heavy, and then you just had a bunch of kind of goulash. And so in terms of getting the good goulash, I would say like I'm cool with like I don't want to make excuses for like bad signings. At least in terms of like the term. Not that I necessarily think they're bad sign-ins, just that like I can't find myself like working up energy to criticize those moves when sort of you're still looking at a defensive core of Heiskanen, Harley, Lindell, and ideally Liam Bichsel, right? So these moves allow you to bring, for example, Bichsel up, which I honestly, it seems to me like they're bullish on. Like it genuinely seems to me like the reason why you buy out Ryan Sutter is because Ryan Sutter is not going to be comfortable with being a healthy scratch. So you bring in someone like Brendan Smith on a borderline league minimum contract, who's a veteran that plays on the left-hand side, but who, if he gets scratched, he's not going to throw his hands. I mean, he's not going to throw a fit and make a big deal about it. And so I genuinely think they're going to kind of treat Bichsel like the way they did Harley the year he made his not his debut, but the year they had him go in Texas, work on his defense, and then eventually brought him up into the playoffs. And I think that's the plan for Bichsel. And I think you're probably going to be looking at Lindell with Heiskanen, Harley with Dumba, and likely Bichsel with Lyubushkin, maybe like middle or towards the end of the year. And I think it's a solid blue line. Like I don't think it's a bad blue line at all.
To answer the Patrick Eves, he was traded to Anaheim in 2017, which did result in a first round pick. So in the 2017 draft, the Stars made a trade, and that pick went to the Blackhawks. So the Stars moved up in there along with a third round pick, went to Chicago. The Stars moved up to 26. From the 29th spot, they drafted goaltender Jake Ottinger.
There you go. There's the trade tree. I knew there was a reason why like I had such fond memories of Patrick Eves, and it was because of like how they kind of leveraged his value in that trade with Anaheim. So thank you for that.
I mean, I think that's fun to always look back and see what these like trades can, sometimes it results in nothing, and other times it's, I was thinking the other day, I just randomly think like, okay, we got Jason Spezza from Ottawa, and those players really didn't do much. I'm just fascinated by trades. I'm fascinated by them in baseball. I look years later and I'm like, okay, did the Rangers benefit from, trading this player? And a lot of times they don't. And a lot of times they get players in return and those players amount to nothing. So, but
do you remember, sorry about that. I was just going to say, do you remember, I'm pretty sure it was Sean that wrote a story back when he was still with the Athletic about about how that Julius Honka goal against Arizona. I'm pretty sure it was an overtime goal that we like love, back when we were all like, just innocent, wide-eyed, and thought Julius Honka was going to be great. He scores that overtime goal because of his like 16 games with that last Lindy Ruff season, and that win over Arizona was essentially kind of what allowed them to finish in the standings, where they would eventually hit the lottery and draft Miro Heiskanen.
Yeah, it's crazy.
It you really thought respect Honka. That's all. I'm just respect him. That's all I'm
saying. What could have been? Okay, so David tweeted earlier, listening to Spits and Suds, and he disagreed. I had Joey Erickson from Locked On Stars, and one of the questions from a Stars fan into Spits and Suds was, "What do you think a new contract for Jamie Benn would look like?" Joey and I thought to ourselves, if we were playing GM, it would be a few years at $4 to $4.5 million. You disagreed with us, David, and you said that the analytics show that he's basically worth more, correct?
Yeah, I mean, it's not. I mean, it's a matter of I think it's not, to me, it's not just about like numbers. I think it's also about the fact that like if you're Ben and his agent, what you're telling Dallas and what you're telling the rest of the league is that, hey, here's this physical power forward who's still extremely productive, who can still play on the top power play. He can also help develop your young forwards. And he can give you 60 points along with being just a beast in the postseason. You have all the leverage. Like, you can go wherever you want. And so I have a hard time. I mean, yes, of course, there's always that human element of like, well, what kind of like, does Ben want to win or not? And what kind of discount should he take? And yada, yada. I mean, like, Ben is from British Columbia, Canada, which is a beautiful little island. Like, he's, if he wants to go home, it's not necessarily going to be Texas. Yes, he's called it his home, but I don't necessarily, I just don't think that there's any reason for him or his management to get sentimental about this, because if you want your retirement fund 401k, you've got it. You would name your price. Because also I don't see Ben like necessarily having a down year either. He's going to be either next to Bork and Stankoven or Johnson and Stankoven, still on the top power play unit. It's just like there's no reason why, if you're Ben or his team, why you would take a discount if somebody else can also promise cup aspirations and badly wants you. And of course, with the cap continue to go up, I mean, they're again, we saw how crazy GMs got this year.
Yeah.
Why aren't you given, the same contract that you gave Ben, that you gave Stamkos, or something more? Like,
well, let me throw this out then, David, because in just over a week, Jamie Benn turns 35. So by the end of his Stars contract, and when free agency hits, if he hits the free agent market, he'll be nearing 36 years old. At that point, do you want to give 2-3 years to a 36-year-old? Maybe more?
No. Like, I don't think keeping Ben would be the right move. I think in part because, and it's not because I think he's definitely going to decline. But it's just hard for him to decline in a way that is going to be obvious or make the team what I would hope would make the right decision, just because of like how he's insulated with these young, good players and power play, yada, yada. And so I personally wouldn't, mainly because to me, I think of like Robertson and Hintz and Heiskanen as the veterans. I think of the emerging core as the Johnstons, Stankovens, Borks, and Bixels. And so I'm not doing it, mainly because I just feel like, hey, like, why not a new voice and let the new core lead their own journeys? And so yeah, I mean, I would just say time for new leadership. Nothing wrong with like Ben. He's been fantastic, but I would not be surprised if Ben gets a pretty nice contract, and I wouldn't be surprised if Dallas is the one to sign it, because why would they? The optics would look bad, right? Oh, you're giving away your captain of the team, who's like one of the few guys that only plays physical, and you're just letting him go. I think discerning fans will realize like that's probably the best decision, but I don't personally see it.
Yeah, I think that's fair on both sides, and that's why I just don't want to go long term, because I think the Stars have been very generous to him. I know that obviously he loves it here. This is his home, but you're right. He grew up in Victoria, so playing for Vancouver or Seattle for a couple of years would be pretty fascinating. But with 1 year left, it'll be interesting, to see. But you're right. He was a beast in the playoffs. There's no doubt about that. He takes it to another level. And, I know Stars fans certainly appreciate his physicality in the playoffs as well. Okay. So we had some fun on Spits and Suds, and we were talking about the prospects and what was happening at the American Airlines Center. And I was just bringing it up to get Sean's thoughts. And Sean just randomly asked me, like, who are you looking forward to seeing? So I had my picks. I had the German goaltender, which, thank you, Spits and Suds listeners. We got so many people that chimed in and said, here's how you pronounce his name. And I was like, okay, got it. So that was on my exciting list. And I wanted to see a couple other players, but I dropped the name Gavin White. And of all things for Sean just to go crazy over. And so he just goes on this Gavin White rant, to which I say, it's not me, it's David Castillo that's a Gavin White that brings him up. And he said, well, that explains all the Gavin White love. So, Mr. Castillo, I give you the forum. And by the way, this is a guy that was playing minutes in Texas. So it's not like, I understand what Sean says about prospects, and he's a little fickle at this point. And I get it. I'm just fascinated because you do follow a lot of Texas, and you know what they've been doing, and you're intrigued by Gavin White.
I really thought I was prepared for this. I guess I wasn't. So one of the things that this didn't really occur to me until, by the way, I get like, you could like hear, I could at least hear Sean's brain turn into like the brain from Scanners, and just like the sound of it about to pop. But I think one of the things that maybe sort of people don't realize when they sort of follow my work, whether it's on social media, Starstat, D Magazine, whatever, is that I am not a professional. Not by a long shot. So you should absolutely be taking my opinions with a grain of salt. But but I do want to be clear. I have I have never once said that I think Gavin White is an NHL quality player. What I think Gavin White is he's an interesting AHL defender, and that's, I know that like there have been several times when I've sort of clipped one of his shifts, mainly because I think when I'm looking at players in the AHL, I'm trying to like compare them with others. So for me, when I was watching Gavin White, I was kind of thinking of him compared to Christian Kyrou, who was second round pick a couple of years back. I think people sort of mostly think highly of Kyrou because of his pedigree, not just his brother being an NHL, just a brilliant NHL player, but also the fact that Kyrou, put up some serious like video game numbers in juniors. And so when I was watching these players and just kind of comparing them with each other, I'm like, Gavin White is just more impressive to me than Christian Kyrou. And he's a plus athlete, which I think is also kind of helpful. And so when I would write about the Texas Stars, Gavin White would be a name I would bring up every now and then. And mainly because I thought he was an interesting player, not because I thought like, well, he's, free White, and or to defend the honor of Gavins all across the world, although that's definitely part of it.
Sure.
And so yeah, let's clear that up. I don't know who's taken what I'm writing and like using that as an excuse to harass poor curmudgeonly Sean, who I know has a very skeptic's heart when it comes to prospects, which I think is like totally valid, by the way. Like, I mean, that's given what we've seen, given how development operates in the NHL as well. Like, I get that. But nonetheless, like, I just think Gavin White was an interesting dude. Injuries kind of like sort of sideline him, but when you're watching the AHL, I think for the most part, keep in mind, right? Dallas really only has two players that I think are certified NHL ready and NHL certified, which is Bixel and Bork. After that, it's like, I mean, the only player that I think really has long shot potential is Kyrou. And after that, it's just like, it's kind of the usual sort of like gruel of players who can kind of give you an interesting shift here and there. Man, I hate to be talking. See, now I'm talking crap about Gavin White, and I love that
No,
dude.
hey, listen, I'm going to be a fan of him just because I want him to prove everyone wrong. Um, but I'll say this, and this has been a wealth of riches that Jim Nill and his staff have produced, because when you look at the prospects, not only have we seen youth just completely go up to the NHL and transform this Dallas Stars franchise, but the quickness, David, in which they've been elevated to NHL levels and played that way. I mean, when you look at Logan Stankoven, I mean, that wasn't even a full year in the AHL. And then you look at the development of Maverick Bork and how quickly that was. Sure, he did spend last year and really just took off the second half of the year. And then last year we saw he went on to win the AHL MVP. But then you look at, you got Bork, Stankoven, Bixel, Wyatt Johnston, Thomas Harley. So as a person who's greedy after all these riches, I think Stars fans will join me in asking, like, after Bixel comes up, who's next? And is it possible to have a who's next after all the players that have come so quickly through the organization?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. It's kind of it's the thing that I was sort of arguing with, like a certain section of the fan base, I should say, before Stankoven came up, which is that, like, hey, I was very pro Stankoven even at Traverse City, where I just felt like this kid's dynamite. He's going to play in the NHL. I think it should be sooner rather than later. It wasn't, which is fun because now he's Calder eligible right next season, and can be kind of mentioned alongside names like Celebrini, and I'm trying to think of, like, for some reason I just like completely blanked out. By the way, Caden Lindstrom was the guy that I had ranked like second on my personal list. Columbus drafted him, another player to look out for, in addition to all the other sort of brilliant young players that are going to be Calder eligible this year. But yeah, it's a credit to the staff. And I think it's the reason why, like, I'm more optimistic than usual when it comes to prospects, which is they've just been knocking it out of the park. Not all of them have been perfect. I thought this year was another example. I was kind of on an island there, but we're not going to get into who I think they should have drafted this year, because again, they have earned the benefit of the doubt, and that's kind of the bottom line.
The last thing you want to hear when you need your auto insurance most is,
"Thank you for calling. Please listen to your list of 46 possible service options."
which is why when you choose USAA Auto Insurance, you'll get great service that is easy and reliable. 24/7 online service for claims, access to roadside assistance, and more, all at the touch of a button. Start getting the service you deserve. Get a quote today. Ability to receive a quote depends on membership eligibility. Membership eligibility and product restrictions apply and are subject to change. USAA means United Services Automobile Association and its affiliate, San Antonio, Texas.
When you need mealtime inspiration, it's worth shopping Kroger, where you'll find over 30,000 mouth-watering choices that excite your inner foodie. And no matter what tasty choice you make, you'll enjoy our everyday low prices, plus extra ways to save, like digital coupons worth over $600 each week. You can also save up to $1 off per gallon at the pump with fuel points. More savings and more inspiring flavors make shopping Kroger worth it every time. Kroger, fresh for everyone. Fuel restrictions apply.
Yeah, I think when you win GM, even with free agency, GM two years in a row, that's certainly something you have to look at and say, okay, in Jim Nill we trust. But I was just curious, and we'll talk to Steven Reserve as the season gets closer, as far as who he feels are some of the names to watch. So we'll see. We'll see about that.
Please ask him about Gavin White.
Of course, that's going to be like every topic now is going to include that. That's like a Spits and Suds favorite now. All right. So finally, after 45 minutes, I give you the floor on Gladiator 2, which, by the way, cost 250 to 310 million to make, 8.5 out of 10 stars for the original Gladiator on IMDb. The question is, does this Gladiator number 2 live up to the first Gladiator?
I'm ready to see sharks in the Coliseum, which I'm pretty sure I saw in the trailer. But what I really wanted to talk about is I just wanted to give a stick tap to Mike and Mark. Part of what I love about kind of working at D Magazine, or working with D Magazine, I should say, is that Mike Palucci and Mark Gottich are like actual professionals. So it's like working for Sports Woodward Bernstein, and I can't just write whatever the hell I want. And I actually love that. Like, I feel qualified to write, but I'm not qualified to judge, and they are. And Mike and I kind of discussed how this piece would sort of make sense to a mass audience, and kind of away we went. And sort of, I just think kind of working with people like that helps you grow, because you're always challenged. And yeah, I want to be free to write something I myself would want to read, but I also want freedom from like sloppy writing or something that's like half cocked. And, that's what the Substack is for. But I just want to mention those two because, especially Mike, just because, it's like, I was surprised that the piece seemed pretty well received. Even though like it's tough to kind of, it's tough to talk about analytics in a way that kind of gives respect to the people that already buy them, but also the people that don't buy them at all, and they're just kind of like sort of against that. And so again, those guys really kind of help do that, and hopefully they'll let me write a piece about Gladiator 2 at D Magazine. I don't know how that's going to work, but we shall see.
I think they deserve a massive stick tap, because they have, between Robert, you, Sean, they've assembled some terrific Stars writers. And what's super cool about things like Victory Plus coming in, if hopefully what I talked about as far as content galore shows up on that app, that's the goal of starting like things like Spits and Suds, is creating content for Stars fans. And that's why I love shouting out D Magazine, because this wasn't the case. And I feel like D Magazine is putting a lot of effort into Stars coverage. And that's really, really cool. I give credit to the Dallas Morning News. For a while, when Matthew DeFranks left to St. Louis, we didn't know, are they going to even have a writer? And here comes this high school writer, and Leah Simakopoulos, and just, to me, kicks ass. I'm biased because she shows up on Spits and Suds, but I thought she did a really, really nice job and gave us some insight when she came on the podcast, as far as inside the room. So, stick tap to her as well. So I think Stars content as a whole, and people sometimes ask, like, what do you think of this podcast? Or what do you think of this? And David, I just say, like, I think it's great they're doing Stars content. Like, I don't feel as though Spits and Suds, like, I'm not in the competition business with this podcast. I spend enough time in the competition business for the radio station. So to me, it's like, I do this. We started this to fill a void. And I think that void is not just being filled by Spits and Suds, it's being filled by a lot, including D Magazine. So I equal your stick tap.
Well, I mean, that stick tap also goes to you as well. That is, sort of what kind of your podcast does, is you also kind of you bring us all together, which is really important. Because I mean, it's we've kind of talked about this before, and I've kind of ranted about sort of this sort of dystopian kind of future and sort of media coverage, and how it's just insane to think that you can have a team with like real cup aspirations and not have like dedicated coverage for that, for fans to kind of be that sort of fan brain, and that is what you are. You are the fan brain for us, Gavin, when it
No.
comes to Stars coverage. And well, really more of like a fan soundboard because
I just appreciate you guys. I appreciate you guys coming on. And you know what I'm excited about is I have a feeling, and this is my shameless plug, I would love to see D Magazine do a feature on the emergency of women's hockey in DFW.
oh man, is that a challenge to me to like write that piece?
I think when you look at, you know, what's going on with Allison Simpson being drafted by New York, Hannah Bilka being drafted, you know, by Boston. We have the Hockey East Rookie of the Year that lives here in DFW that goes to UVM. Like, I think the future is bright. We talk about the emergence of youth hockey, and there's been so much of a focus on the male game that I think the growth in the women's game is just absolutely tremendous. I mean, we have 2 USA players that come from DFW. That is absolutely amazing when you look at Simpson and Bilka, and they both played in the Final Four or Frozen Four. So, I personally am a fan of the women's game. I think it's actually a lot more physical than people think. And I think that, you know, you need to be a different kind of player in the PWHL compared to, and I'm not trying to go down to like a women's hockey rabbit hole, but what I am saying is like, it would be wrong of me to say that we're trying to grow the great game here in DFW and not pay attention. And one of the things I'm most proud of is the fact that others are giving recognition to Hannah Bilka to the point where I can't even get her on the podcast anymore.
No, that is, you know, I think the other thing too is that like my sort of lens is always kind of like I always have tunnel vision because I feel like I sort of, if I'm gonna write about hockey, it needs to be sort of from this kind of quote unquote analytic point of view and whatnot. Which is funny because I don't really necessarily like sort of posting charts and player cards on like an article, but I also feel like, you know, you kind of talk about that, and which is fantastic, and I love it. Listeners should love it, because I think also if you really want to understand hockey better, then you should be watching stuff like women's hockey. You should be, you know, kind of like we talked about with like the draft. If you want to be a better, you know, you don't have to, right? You know, you can process the game however you want, go to a hockey game, have a beer, and just kind of enjoy the game in and of itself. And that's cool. But if you really want to be stronger at understanding what's happening on ice, stronger at understanding sort of the climate, not just the weather of hockey, then stuff like that is important. Women's hockey is important in that context. It would be important regardless, but just that I'm really glad you do that because I think that is, from my perspective, I think that is essential to analysis. And so, yeah, stick tap to Gavin Spittle.
Well, thank you. Thank you. I did want to end, and I was going to bring this up with Sean, but I would probably forget about it. But random NHL fact that I absolutely love. David Perron signs a 2-year contract with the Ottawa Senators. He will now play with Brady Tkachuk in Ottawa. And by the way, keep an eye on Ottawa. I'm not saying that that's a tough division to make a run, but boy, they have some nice pieces up in Ottawa. So I bring up David Perron because to me, hard to believe, 1,131 games played, 768 points. He's got a cup. At the same time, as I mentioned, he's going to play with Brady Tkachuk. He started his career in St. Louis playing with Brady's dad, Keith Tkachuk. It's not talked about, but I love that. To me, it's like, that's a guy that, you know, has been on a bunch of teams, great room guy, cool dude, looks still like he's 25. And I just wanted to point that out because it's a nice story that might not be talked about, but how cool is that? And I was actually listening to an interview with TSN, and he was actually talking about from his experience that when Ottawa goes on a dad's trip, he's going to keep his dad away from Keith because Keith likes to party so hard.
I had no idea. I didn't even know David Perrin signed, or I didn't even know he had signed in Ottawa. But I also I remember Keith Kachuk, and he was sort of one of the few guys that actually kind of decided, yeah, okay, dropping the gloves with Darren Hatcher is a good idea. So always appreciated his game. Obviously, like all the Kachucks are absolutely fantastic. And
Yeah.
that's a super cool little tidbit. I had no idea. Didn't even know he signed in Ottawa. And I agree about Ottawa. I do think that they're not like a sleeping giant or anything like that, but they're absolutely like a team that has really graded out well and probably should have deserved more success if it just wasn't for like awful goaltending. And yeah, you talk about like the defense being kind of a part of that, but
changes.
They had a really good. For years they had a great blue line. I mean, you're talking about like Chikrin, Shabbat, Jake Sanderson, who was fantastic. I mean, Arthur Zub. I mean, like they really had like I think all the pieces to be a competitive team. So I think it is a matter of time before they turn it around. But would I also be surprised if somehow like they just kind of don't make it again?
Yeah,
not necessarily. But I think they are like a well-built team that just kind of gotten like just rotten luck, really.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And the stadium's outside of Ottawa, so they don't necessarily, I mean, people talk about, well, Ottawa doesn't draw big crowds. Well, that's the equivalent here of having a stadium in Frisco. I mean, you're going to draw from that area, but it's tough on a Tuesday night to go from Dallas to Frisco and fight traffic. That's what a lot of people talk about Arizona. If that stadium was downtown, which they tried to do, or get it in Tempe, I think it would have had success. The reality is, I'm not going to drive that far. On a Saturday night, staying in Scottsdale, it took me 45 minutes to go see the Coyote Stars. So, that was one of the issues. But yeah, I think Ottawa is going to be interesting. The other interesting Ottawa tidbit was watching an interview with Linus Ullmark, who Ottawa, now you mentioned goaltenders, finally has a goaltender. And they asked him about waiving his modified no trade clause, just assuming that Ottawa was on that list. And Allmark was like, no. He's like, I didn't waive anything. Ottawa was one of the teams he was fine with. So I think that was interesting as well.
I mean, do you think this should be like made publicly available? I'm sure there's like an educated opinion about this, but like I have no concept.
I personally, this goes back to a cap friendly discussion where some feel it's private information. To me, I understand what they're saying. However, people playing GM makes the game more popular. That's why fantasy football is so gravitating, because you get to play GM, you get to select. So to play salary cap as a GM, to me, is an exciting venture as a hockey fan. So understand why they want to take it away, because for some reason, several teams were using it and didn't have their own people, which was fascinating in itself. But at the same time, I think it hurts overall, because the passive hockey fan can't necessarily say, well, I think we'll trade those pieces, because you might not know. Do they have a modified no trade? Do they have a no trade clause?
Yeah, I mean, that's like I don't I don't know where else to go with that other than that.
There's no else.
I really wish Lindell didn't have a no movement clause.
Yeah, I mean, we're going to end this podcast because I just brought up Ottawa twice.
That's pretty bad. I mean, like, I think for at least for casual hockey fans, I think for hardcore fans, they're like, oh, awesome, they're talking about Ottawa. That's amazing on a Stars podcast. But
I just sometimes when I see tidbits, I'm like, Sean points this out on the podcast too. It's like, I think some people do want to hear these things every once in a while. And I think as long as you don't overrun, but I think people and Spits and Suds listeners tell me, like, I like going around the NHL and I like talking about these tidbits, because I think people get educated and sometimes you find out things, that you didn't ordinarily know. So,
and of course they could always affect Dallas, right? I mean, like, if you should be, well, if you have time, you should be following like the sport as a whole and not just the Stars, because hey, when that trade deadline comes around, you're going to want to know whether or not Dallas is adding somebody that's awesome or adding somebody that's just like, for show.
Yeah. Well, it's a great article. Everyone go to D Magazine and click. Did the Stars Moneyball their offseason? And the author, as he always does, joins us. Also, Stars Stack is his Substack where David does a lot of writing. So please check him out there. And you can get all his information on his Twitter/X account at David Castillo AC. Always a pleasure, my friend. Thank you for joining us on Spits and Suds.
Thank you. We'll talk about Gladiator 2 next time.